Have any of your tall friends ever teased you by calling you a hobbit? Have you ever heard somebody joking with their friend about the relative size of their purse by saying it's like the wardrobe to Narnia because of how many things they can fit inside of it? Clearly, these are references to J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. It's not surprising that we recognize these references, given the significant impact that these works have had upon our culture over the last century, with major motion pictures having been devoted to both of them within the last few decades. At 150 million copies, Lord of the Rings actually ranks third best-selling novel in all of history, according to James Clear of the New York Times. Now, while many are familiar with the works of these men, what a lot of people do not know is that Lewis and Tolkien were, in fact, good friends with one another. Since they are two of my favorite authors, I've been reading books and articles about these two men for years, and I'd like to share with you what I've learned. What I've found is that not only were they good friends with one another, but it was particularly this friendship which helped to define each man and their works, which consequently affected us. So I'm going to share with you how their similar backgrounds, common interests, led to their friendship in the first place, and then I'm going to talk about the influence of that friendship upon each man and their works. To begin with, their common backgrounds. Lewis and Tolkien were both exceptionally bright and imaginative from boyhood, and they never fully lost that. In his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, Lewis talks about experiencing moments of intense longing for high and noble things. Tolkien similarly began work on his fantasy world as just a teenager, and we actually find the first traces of what would eventually become Middle-earth in some letters that he wrote home during his service in the military during World War I. Which brings me to World War I. Incidentally, both Lewis and Tolkien were second lieutenants in the British Expeditionary Forces during the Great War. Having both narrowly survived the horrors of trench warfare, both men came out deeply affected by the experience, which I'll talk about more in a minute. After the war, both Lewis and Tolkien pursued their education and went on to become professors of English literature at Oxford University. Now to their common interests. As I just said, both of them were professors of English literature, which means they both shared a love of the English language. Tolkien's expertise lay more in the Celtic and Nordic influences upon the language, and Lewis was more expert in the Latin influences, such as French. However, both men were extremely brilliant and shared a love of all things Anglo-Saxon, from books to poetry. Which brings me to the second common interest that they shared. Tolkien and Lewis were ecstatic to find in each other a fellow lover of Norse mythology. Since boyhood, Lewis was deeply affected and haunted, as he says, by the feeling of northernness, as he calls it, when he first read of Balder the Beautiful. Tolkien actually was the first person to translate the original manuscript of the Danish epic Beowulf. Perhaps the greatest common interest that these men shared, however, was Christianity, and how both of them found it to be profoundly real. This is significant because of their experience during the Great War. Whereas many other authors of the time allowed the horrors of that time to drive them to a cynicism and skepticism of things like the good and the beautiful, Tolkien and Lewis surprisingly allowed these experiences of suffering and grief to solidify their Christian worldview. Now that I've talked about their common interests and similar backgrounds and how that led to their friendship, I'm going to talk about their influence upon one another. Lewis has been described as the greatest Christian apologist of the 20th century. What many people do not know is we actually largely have Tolkien to thank for that. When they met, Lewis was a proclaimed atheist. Tolkien was a significant influence upon Lewis in coming to the Christian faith when he was experiencing doubts. As Ethan Gilsdorf says in his article, Tolkien and Lewis, Literary Friends and rivals. The influence worked both ways, however. Tolkien was extremely pessimistic about the pet projects of his, which would eventually become the manuscripts for what we know as The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. They were much belittled by their colleagues. However, Lewis was adamant and encouraging that Tolkien both finish and publish these works, being critical along the way. Well, clearly, these eventually became hits and bestsellers very quickly. So, they have an influence upon one another, and this can very much be seen in similarities between their actual works themselves. Not only do we know that they both wrote fantasy works, but we can see similarities between these works, actually. Who can help but notice the similarities between the Ents of Middle-earth and the talking trees of Narnia? Similarly, they both employed their love of Norse mythology in their works. It was very surprising how Lewis and Tolkien both utilized a concept of the gods into their intrinsically Christian works. Now that I've talked about these two men's friendship and what led to it and their works, we can see how this friendship was particularly influential. Lewis and Tolkien have been described by many, including Joseph Pearce of The Imaginative Conservative, as two of the most popular and influential authors of the last century, and perhaps of all time. And to think that might never have been the case if they had not become friends and encouraged each other and shared common experiences and interests. Now that you know a little bit more about these two men, you can appreciate their work on a whole new level.